Hello, everybody, and welcome back to TARTLEcast. You are joining me here today in the studio with a special guest, Matt Van Italy from Sema AI. He is working on a pretty cool product that goes into the code bases and really checks if things are ethical and buttoned up to snuff for the Gen AI world. So, Matt, real pleasure to have you on.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm really looking forward to this.
Yeah, no, it's very, very good. And I know you're doing some cool stuff, and there's a lot of buzz around artificial intelligence. So I think it's important to have individuals like you on here to shed some reality to the situation. And you right now are the founder and CEO of Sema. So tell me a little bit about the firm itself, and then we'll do a little bit of a dive into some other subjects.
Sure. So we've been around for 7 years, and our North Star has been and continues to be helping make software engineering teams understandable to non-technical audiences. I was a software executive, and I always felt like but not a coder, not a professional coder. I always thought I had a pretty good understanding of what was going on in marketing and finance and professional services. But when it came time to coding, it always felt like a real black box on the outside looking in. And so we've worked pretty hard over the last 7 years to make code understandable and understand questions about what's inside the code. And then, as you said, over the last year, we took a deep dive in understanding. Think of it like an ingredients list. Some of that code is written by the team. Some of that code is written by the open source community, but now an increasing amount is written by LLMs. It's prompted by humans, but it's written by LLMs, and that comes with some real opportunities, but also some risks that we've had the honor to help look into.
So when it talks about those risks, how are you guys identifying the ingredients, and how do you cordon them off to say, hey, this is LLM, this is the internal team, this is XYZ. And then after you've done that, how do you translate that to people who need to act upon that risk, like other members of the executive teams that you're analyzing their code base for?
Exactly. So we use a deep learning model. We use AI to detect whether something is AI or not. Some of your listeners may be wondering, it's a very good question, but isn't it really nearly impossible to tell what was AI generated versus not an AI generated? And in many fields that may be true, but it's not true for code. Code, if you look at a large enough chunk of it, leaves behind a signal in the syntax or the structure, or sometimes just the coding choices that we're able, thanks to training it on Gen AI code and not Gen AI code, can tell with sufficient accuracy whether or not it's Gen AI or not. That's how we do it. And then the translation, you said it exactly right, is really the most important part, because now that you know it, then how do you make sense of it? We've studied a lot and researched and talked to users and talked to industry experts and ethicists, and have been developing standards. This too little, we think of it like Goldilocks. Too little, and developers aren't getting the benefit of, it's really joyful to use it if you use it the right way. Too much, certainly too much in the wrong way, and you put your business at risk, the code base at risk, etc. So the standards really nudge people to the golden middle, to the just right amount of Gen AI usage.
Very cool. And have you used your own system on your own AI?
For sure. We absolutely do.
What was the outcome for you? Because I find that very interesting.
Yeah, we are big fans of dog fooding, so it's not perfectly accurate. Again, prediction of AI is not immediate. We actually tested it a ton on ourselves once we finished the prototype and used that to refine. Now it's quite accurate, and we look at it as a team to understand if we're heading in the right direction or not on our usage.
Very cool. And where have you seen the most amount of difficulty in prediction and accuracy? Where do you think some of the data elements or algorithmic design may be lacking that would allow you to
one
really
area that is by far the most challenging. Do you want to guess?
To determine whether or not it was made by an LLM? Probably on design, when the part of the code base for design, like UX.
And what's your hypothesis for that?
My hypothesis for UX design is that the AI would think something would work as best in a specific visual format or interactive format, but in truth, it's maybe best for the computer, but not for the interaction with humans.
Yeah. Although you can imagine under certain circumstances, it becomes so obviously computer, it's doing what I want, not what I think a coder would want. So
was I close?
that is one of the areas.
Mm.
Another one I'd say on the short list is computer-generated code that wasn't generated by an LLM. So there's some internal tools that automatically produce code, DevOps tools, and put it into your code.
So
We've
like a
had
co-pilot,
a
right?
non-AI copilot, that's
An
right,
AI
where
co-pilot.
it's pulling things in. And so clearly a lot of what the tool is doing is looking for computer-generated versus not computer-generated. And so we've had to spend a lot of time breaking out, what we really care about. Is it coming from a prompt, or is it coming from a prompt versus other ways that it might be automatically being introduced?
That's really quite interesting. And you feel that once you get down to a pretty significant solve, Sema is going to be incredibly accurate with predicting these things internally.
So at the risk of hinting but not sharing the total secret sauce, we had to do method A, which is using this prediction method in part because of our first use case. Our first use case is, this code scans that we've done for 7 years.
Mm-hmm.
We help understand code bases at times of diligence, buying and selling of software companies, software assets. And in that moment, the only source we have access to is the history of the code. And so the best we can do is use that as the only data set. In phase 2, and it's going to have some natural limits on how accurate it can be. For ongoing usage, we don't just have to look at the code itself. We can look at some supporting analytics, and that can be effectively 100%. So we'll keep improving.
Analytics on the code, you mean?
Yeah, so imagine, let's see, without revealing it, less about analytics on the code and more about data sources. So there are pipelines between what the coder is doing and the internet and tools. And so that by understanding the pipeline, it's possible to get to a much higher level of accuracy.
I know what you guys have done. Very cool. And it's a nice way to trace provenance of the data inputs. I get it.
Exactly right.
Cool. Very, very cool. So in what level of accuracy do you think you're going to be at? You really think close to 100%?
Yeah, it's probably going to be 99 because, something that will still be a black box even to looking at the pipeline, say, is if a coder copies in 50 lines of code from some other source, you're not going to be able to tell from the pipeline where that came from. You're going to have to be able to predict it based on its content. And so there still will be, we estimate in the order of 1% off from 100, 99% accuracy.
Very, very cool. Very, very cool. And have you had any difficulty selling this idea of scanning people's code bases? Have you had any challenges with that?
So broadly, we've scanned code bases for the last 7 years. If you think about it, we're a bit like the whole product, including AI detection, is a bit like a home inspection. If you're buying or selling a house, you get this report that does the roof, the plumbing, your electricity. It's comprehensive. Similarly, if you're buying or selling a company that has software, you get a comprehensive assessment of the security, the quality, the AI risk, the team, the process, and the cyber, and so on. We have done it for so long. We've looked at $1.5 trillion worth of companies and we're incredibly honored to serve some of the world's most sophisticated investors. That just hasn't. And I guess probably the most important part, besides the other parts of why this is possible, besides our security program, is that we're a third party. We are not the buyer. We are not the seller. We are an intermediary whose job it is to get an objective truth, and that has really helped us.
Very, very cool. And you've chosen to go down the path of artificial intelligence, using it, and also trying to identify it. And you've been doing it for 7 years. Matt, why did you choose to go down this path?
I love solving logical problems that matter, and maybe human systems in particular that could be better. Earlier in my career, I tried to help improve low-performing school districts, which is definitely a human systems that could be improved with logic, among other things. When I started serving in enterprise software, the logical need for this just really jumped out at me. I mean, if any of you have sat in an executive team meeting of a software company, the chief revenue officer pulls up a dashboard on a CRM like Salesforce and uses data from that dashboard to talk about the state of sales and the state of salespeople, and of course, in teams. And of course, that data comes from code about sales and salespeople. And I just watched our amazing engineering leaders not have code to understand code and coders. And it's just the logic of it. The logic just seems so obvious and such a fun problem to figure out because it's a really hard problem. Code, has hundreds. There are hundreds of languages. 50 of them at least really matter. And so if you want to understand code, you have to understand each of those 50 individually. So it was a really fun organizational effort.
Super cool. And that's why you wanted to pursue this, especially with systems and artificial intelligence, as you think this could be applied to, again, human-led systems, but now will be increasingly fattened up with AI or LLM code for their code bases. Because, there's things like Cursor and GitHub Copilot that people are using to do mid-level engineer work, and it's very repeatable stuff. But there's risks involved when you're doing plug and chug work like that, especially if the people using it don't fundamentally or foundationally understand how, code is working.
Yeah, and that's a perfect segue into managing AI code risks. So kudos to you. We have found, we know that the most ethical, the safest, the most appropriate way to use Gen AI code is to ensure there's a human in the loop. Now, those of you listening who are thinking about AI usage in other fields, this will be familiar to you because it's important for insurance decisions, all kinds of different decisions. But a human in the loop, we very much like Gen AI code as a first draft, but it must get human review. It must get a second code review. You've got to put it through all of the tools to make sure that the code is accurate. Those are all absolute must-haves. And it's really the only responsible way to be using Gen AI, no matter how good those Gen AI coding tools are.
I see that. Now, you talk a lot about responsibility. You talk about ethics. You talk about a human in the loop because it's a feedback loop, and you really hope that you have some RTHF, real-time human feedback. What, Matt, in your professional opinion, do you think the field of artificial intelligence needs to really advance from where it is today and going forward, knowing what you know and the code bases you've scanned over the past 7 years?
Well, I know that on the other side of this recording is someone who's thought deeply about this question, so I will put it back over to you in a second. In our very narrow domain of Gen AI code, I studied history in undergrad, and I really believe in pattern matching. Maybe history doesn't repeat, but it rhymes. And also, if you can analogize something to an earlier understandable situation, it just really helps people understand the right choices to make. And for us, really clearly, it seems Gen AI code is similar to open source code. As you know, open source code is created by community members. Under certain circumstances, it's free to use. It is a must-have for being a modern developer. If you told someone you were a developer and you weren't using open source, you were writing everything by hand, they'd look at you like you were a Luddite. But open source comes with security risk and IP risk and maintainability risk. And so it is a very well-established, there are very well-established protocols and trainings and supports to make sure that there is a human in the loop on open source code, which again, while it was written by a human, your own team at whoever company is using it needs to keep track. We think that really holds up for Gen AI code. It is also not written by your team. It's written by a prompt, but it makes sense. It helps developers go faster and have more fun, but it comes with IP risk and security risk and maintainability risk. And the answer is treating it not identically to the code you've written, but appropriately given the risks involved.
And how do you determine what's appropriate, Matt, when you talk about what the field needs? Now, what Matt thinks is appropriate may not be the same for somebody else.
Yeah, I cannot stress this is neither legal nor policy advice. I go back to our standards. If you told me a code base that mattered, that not just life impacting, finance impacting, but mattered, I would be nervous if more than 10% of it came out of an LLM untouched by a human. And so we say above 10% pure Gen AI is risky, and there'd better be a really darn good reason. I mean, if it's a prototype or social app or something, it's fine. But when things matter, we really look for that 10% threshold at a maximum for the code to be untouched.
And how often do you find people at or exceeding the 10%?
10% pure is pretty rare, under 10% of the cases. The overall Gen AI usage is obviously increasing dramatically. It's not uncommon to see some Gen AI be in the 20 to 30% range. But again, this is as amazing as it may be, it's still an extension of other tools that have helped developers over the last decades. And developers know, treat other code with some skepticism, review it, make it theirs, make sure it's right, etc. And so I'm not at all surprised that the amount of, the number of times where the pure Gen AI code is above 10 is really quite low.
Really? But do you see those rates trending up, though?
Absolutely.
And do you
Absolutely.
find that as those rates trend up, it may become more difficult in the future for you to identify these things, even though you're looking at the provenance of the data analytically, but it will get very good at mimicking how humans are writing code. It'll become more novel.
Yeah, I do. I accept that premise, sort of like an elementary school student saying, please write this paper for me, but write it in the style of a fifth grader with plenty of
Yeah.
human qualities. I think what you'd have to believe is that humans are incentivized to mask how much Gen AI code is in it, just like humans are incentivized to mask whether or not they're cheating on tests, etc. I don't think that moment has arrived, but I do think it is coming, because if people want the code to be modified and coders would rather not, they might have incentives to fake it. Two things give me hope. One is asking developers to asking developers to ignore code reviews of code that someone else wrote is pretty unnatural. It's against the ethos of the profession.
Okay.
Most coders go into this. Code is a craft. You're not going to IKEA to buy a cup. You want to make the cup yourself, and you want to make sure the cup is right. And that ethos of craftspersonship really helps. So that's, I think, on the positive side. On the negative side, if you will, the pipeline review still works. There's a bulk of information coming from iSource, and then it gets modified or it doesn't. So even if it will reduce the accuracy, if people start gaming in a negative way, the end result, it'll make it difficult for that home inspection detection, but it will not affect the pipeline.
Very cool. So with Sema and what you're doing, Matt, where could people find out more about your business or even request one of these reviews?
Absolutely. We are at semasoftware.com, SEMA software.com. I am always happy to talk to folks who are curious or want to learn more. Any of the buttons on our website will get to me, but you're also welcome to write me at MVI, that's Matt Van Italy, at semasoftware.com.
Lister, this has been fantastic. I appreciate you coming on, speaking about the work you're doing at Sema and a little bit about your history and also how you view the field developing. So thank you for joining me today, Matt.
It was a real pleasure. Thanks so much for having me.
You're most welcome.